Good morning, everyone. We want to start our meeting. Want to welcome you to this first meeting of the Senate Assembly Select Committees on Improving State Government. I also want to thank the Senator Steinberg, the Pro Tem, and Speaker Bass for convening this group, and I want to thank my co-chair, Assemblymember Feuer, who is going to run the meeting this morning, and then I will attempt to follow his act this afternoon. I also want to thank all of my colleagues. It's great to have such a great turnout this first meeting, and hopefully it will continue. Just briefly on my part, I've felt for a long time that many of the systemic problems that those who observe California government longer than I have brought to my attention, both in local government and now here in the legislature, as being some of the roadblocks to us being able to perform our jobs. So I am hopeful that the next 3 months will be both bicameral and bipartisan effort to look at how we could do better in this building, and we're going to start with some things that we actually think we can do relatively easily, and then look at future meetings at some of the thornier problems facing the state of California, including the initiative system. So with that, I will turn it over to my co-chair, Mr. Feuer, and look forward to, as I said, a really thoughtful process that will result in a series of recommendations to the leadership and all of our colleagues in both houses in January as we start another challenging year here in the California State Legislature.
Thank you very much, Senator. You know, Mark and I have been working for a while on this process, and it's a real honor to be able to do this with you. And I know that Mark and I also want to say something else in terms of thank yous, and that is both of us are deeply indebted to the staffs of both houses for working so hard, not only put the hearing together logistically, but also the materials that we have before us reflect a tremendous amount of hard work. I want to say a word about why we're here and then get down to brass tacks. You know, I think that all of us recognize that there's a consensus around the state that the key structures of our government need fixing. We were charged by the leaders of the respective houses with drilling down on some really key issues. Giving Californians more value for their tax dollars by making government more efficient and accountable. Requiring government to prioritize key issues so that we make the toughest decisions in the state and don't pass the buck. You know, cutting through the gridlock here of outmoded rules and sometimes undue partisanship. Making government more transparent and accessible. Diminishing the influence of special interests. Making government more customer friendly. And encouraging decision making that reflects long-term thinking, not just Band-Aids for the short term. I share Mr. DeSaulnier's enthusiasm for this process, and he and I have discussed privately our optimism about how much we could potentially achieve if we work together here. It's an ambitious agenda for us, and I think everyone here feels the same urgency that we do. We don't have time to waste. So let me go right to the process broadly for the next few months and just concisely say that this is the first of 5 hearings. We're purposely holding these hearings throughout the state of California to make this process as accessible to our constituents as we can and encourage their involvement. The success of this project is going to boil down to one thing, and that's concrete results. Ideally, after we go through these 5 hearings, in January we'll emerge with a series of proposals that can be memorialized in rule changes, in statutory changes, and in ballot measures that we can agree to put before the voters. Concrete, specific, tangible results that reflect as much consensus as we can muster here. That's the measure of our success. Clearly, there are going to be some differences of opinion here. And that's okay, because our constituents expect us to express our core values. But at the end of the day, much of what we can engage in this process can be done by consensus. I'm convinced of that, and we'll see evidence of that as soon as today, I'm sure, because we'll discuss legislation that reflects interests on both sides of the aisle. Now, this other hearings are going to focus on the initiative process. They're going to focus on the relationship between state and local government and potentially realigning services, and how we might reorganize state government Today's hearing is going to feature a really impressive array of panelists who are going to come before us. As Mr. DeSaulnier mentioned, I'll be chairing the morning's meeting. The morning's meeting is going to focus on ways that the legislature can reform our own processes. We're going to begin with a discussion about what happened before. How can we learn from efforts to take some of the key, potentially constitutional reforms? What's happened there? How can we learn from that experience? How does that inform our judgment today? We'll learn what's happening in other states and at the federal level. And then we're going to hear from a panel of distinguished experts, including former elected officials and current ones from both sides of the aisle, as well as objective observers of this process. We're going to have a lot of opportunity to ask a lot of questions of these folks. The basic rhythm of today is very few ground rules. We're going to hear from panelists and then have ample opportunity for questions and comments related to what they have to say. Why don't we delve right into this process? I know we want to hear from each of the key minority leaders before us, and then we'll get down to the beginning of the hearing. Did you want to introduce?
I'll ask Senator Strickland if he has any comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I echo the comments of both the chairs of this committee. I'm honored to be part of this process. I'm hoping that we do come together with some consensus. I do believe that we have all the right intentions, and we might disagree on some of the final outcomes, but I think it's good to have this public debate because government hasn't been working, state government, and we need to look at ways that we can make it more efficient. I agree with Assemblyman Feuer's comments about maximizing the dollars that do come to Sacramento. Senator Weiland and I have a proposal that we're hoping to push forward that says that we do a two-year budget cycle that will be easier on local governments. That 1 year you deal with the budget and nothing but the budget and make it more efficient. Next year you do legislation. I think one of the biggest problems we have here in this body is we pass bills, but we don't oversee on making sure that they're implemented and making sure that we measure performance on the bills that come before us. A lot of programs come forward and they promise a lot, but we need to measure those bills and see, did they do what they were intended to do? And I think it's essential that we're all here together. We all have the goals to make government more efficient and represent our constituents to the best we can, and we definitely can improve what we do up here for all the voters and constituents of California. A lot of these issues are not Democratic issues, Republican issues, they're California issues. I'm looking forward to working with the committee to make sure that we have a good final product and take California in a new direction.
Thanks. And I'd like to introduce the minority leader of the State Assembly. But before I do, I just want to say what is so interesting about Senator Strickland's observations is the priorities that he expressed are almost precisely reflected in much of this afternoon's conversation, which gives us a sense off the bat of how much potential there is to achieve some consensus around key issues. It's really an honor that our vice chair on the Assembly side is the minority leader, Sam Blakesley, who always does such a terrific job, both substantively and in the way that he assures the business of the House is conducted. Assemblyman Blakesley.
Thank you, Mr. Feuer, Mr. DeSaulnier. I'm really intrigued by what we will be discussing and working on in these coming weeks and months. I had the pleasure a couple of years ago to visit state legislatures around the country and sit with minority leaders and majority leader speakers, governors, and talk about their processes and how they conducted the business of their houses, and found that there was a broad spectrum of different outcomes which were largely driven by the rules, processes, and cultures that they had internally adopted for themselves. We, of course, know principally the environment in which we operate, and it's sometimes difficult for us to imagine how the system we're used to could be different. And self-reform, I think, is always one of the most sort of challenging exercises anyone, any company, or even any person ultimately engages in, because it's very difficult to see yourself as others do and to appreciate where you could personally make improvements. But that is, I think, the challenge before us, and that certainly is my emphasis, probably a little less so in worrying about trying to ask the voters to change us. I think we have a duty first to look inward and change ourselves. And that change You know, people like stability, people like predictability, people like, you know, a certain consistency in institutions, but every once in a while there's a need for change. And with our polls now showing the legislature's positive opinions in the sort of in the teens, I think this is a time for that change. And I've got a little quote I wanted to share from the Nobel laureate Octavio Paz, who wrote, "Wisdom lies neither in fixity nor in change, but in the dialectic between the two." And I think this is one of those moments where we have an opportunity to look at how we can effect that change. I know I've certainly had the privilege and pleasure of working with Mr. Fuhrer on green chemistry, in which we found a centrist solution that brought people together across the spectrum with a good outcome, and that wouldn't have occurred except but for the fact that he and I were able to establish a process and a culture of trust to ultimately get to a place on a difficult subject. And I'd love to see this wonderful body undergo that self-evaluation process and explore ways that we can formalize internal processes that foster trust, because I think it's in that ability for us both to appreciate the higher purpose for which we sit here and serve the people of California that will ultimately be good stewards of this very critical responsibility that's been given to us.
Thank you, Mr. Blakesley. Now let's get to it. So we're going to have a panel discussion that will succeed in a series of individual presentations, the first of which is by a very esteemed participant. Bill Houck is with us. He's laughing at that reference, but I think it's the least one can say. He's the president of the California Business Roundtable. For this purpose, he is the former chairman of the California Constitutional Reform Commission. He previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor Wilson, as Chief of Staff to two prior speakers. He's the former chair of the Cal State University Trustees. I think esteemed is an understatement. Mr. Houck will speak, and there'll be about 20 minutes allocated to a discussion of what we can learn from prior efforts to reform our Constitution. It's a pleasure. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fuhrer and ladies and gentlemen of the committee. It is a pleasure for me to be here today, even though the subject of the discussion is obviously a serious discussion. Recently, Kevin Starr, who's the former state librarian and an esteemed chronicler of California history, declared that California is in danger of becoming the first failed American state. After I read that statement, I thought about it, and the more I thought about it, the more shocked I was. Because to the extent that this legislature has participated in the ingredients that might be determined as part of that failure, and to the extent that there's truth to that statement, it's pretty distressing. And it's not always been this way. This legislature, many years ago, was a leader in the nation with respect to legislative process and production of legislation. Not only was it a leader in that respect, in many respects, this legislature and this House particularly was involved in changing the institution of the state legislature in the United States. And this all happened under the leadership, or it began at least under the leadership of the gentleman whose picture is on the wall behind you here, Assembly Speaker Jess Unruh. Jess Unruh was as partisan a Democrat as you'll find, but he also was very concerned with the institution of the state legislature in the United States. At the time, and now we're talking about many years ago, at the time, most legislatures had very little capacity to compete, in effect, with the executive branch of government, had no capacity to do analysis, particularly no independent capability to evaluate executive proposals, and very little ability to analyze executive proposed budgets in relation to the priorities of the constituents of each member, as well as the priorities of California. Jess Unruh led the ability for this House first and this legislature then, secondly, to acquire that kind of capacity. And I think over the years that served the legislature well, and it actually led to many productive responses to problems that existed in the state. Now, I would not stand in front of you all this morning to say that that those were the good old days, that the institution operated, well and efficiently in those days. This is an imperfect institution. There's no question about that. In many respects, I think it was designed to be imperfect, and at some level, it was designed to be inefficient. But it wasn't designed not to deal with the problems that face California. It's also true, and you of course know this, that the problems of California 30 years ago are not the problems of California today, and the population of California 30 years ago is not the population of California today. It's not in terms of numbers. Over the last 20 to 30 years, we've more than doubled the population of California. And the demographics of California have changed dramatically during that period of time. But in this building, in the past, there has been a level of trust, which I think Mr. Blakesley referred to. There has been a level of willingness on the part of Democrats and Republicans to actually work together to solve problems. Now, it's true that they didn't always succeed, but the ethic and the culture of the building not only permitted but encouraged Democrats and Republicans to work together to seek and to hopefully achieve solutions to the problems that they were dealing with. My feeling is that today the ethic in this building is to the contrary. In many instances, members are sanctioned for working with people of the other party, and that is not productive. That is not going to address California's difficulties, and it certainly is not what the people of California want this legislature to do, and I know that you are all aware of that. I mean, if Kevin Starr is correct, and I think there is some surface evidence at least that potentially he is correct, in the last 10 years, while revenues on average were growing at about 7%, California managed to accumulate, according to the legislative analyst, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 billion of deferred short and long-term debt, deferred pension liabilities, and deferred health care liabilities, and that is at the state level alone. $200 billion, even for California, is a big number, and at some point these things will have to be addressed, and in fact I think Senator Leno would tell you that they're being addressed in appropriations committees. They're being addressed in relation to calls on the general fund. Even today, certainly the short-term liabilities are, and we face, as we go forward, the prospect of additional deficits for a number of years to come, the expiration of tax increases that will make the deficit even greater. So the task before you certainly is a formidable one. Certainly you are not all responsible for the circumstances that we find ourselves in, but the legislature collectively, along with the governors that have been involved, are responsible for the circumstances that we find ourselves in and need to take responsibility for those circumstances. With that as a preamble, let me say that I believe there are many things that you can do to result in having this House and the Senate operate more effectively and more efficiently as you try to deal with these certainly more than formidable programs. I believe, I didn't check this, but I think it's true, in 1972, and I was involved in writing the constitutional amendment that went to the ballot that created the biennial session. And you have functioned under that biennial session. And interestingly enough, Bob Moretti, who was the speaker, and just as an aside, I did work for Bob. I was his chief of staff. I worked for Willie Brown. I also worked for Pete Wilson. And I've been asked how I could do that. And my answer always, of course, is that it was easy because I have no principles. But it does, I think, reflect that the staff that was hired, starting with Speaker Unruh, when I went to work for the Assembly GO Committee, it was made very clear to me that staff for the committee, not personal staff, but staff for the committee, worked for the whole committee, Republicans and Democrats. And if you didn't, and the Speaker learned that you were not working for all the members of the committee, you could be scheduled for a little phone booth discussion with Jess Unruh. And I think, at least in terms of what you've read about him, nobody would look forward to that kind of discussion. I certainly wouldn't have at the time. So the ability of the legislature to function was enhanced by the fact that he encouraged, even though, as I said, he was a partisan Democrat, he encouraged and demanded that the committee staff work for all members. That resulted in a group of people here in this building who built up a level of trust among all members, and in many instances could become the go-between between members having differing points of view. I think that situation today is much different from that time, and I think it's reflective again of the culture that has evolved in the building that does not permit the kind of cooperation between both sides, even though everybody recognized that at election time they were going to go out and fight it out. While they were here working, that was not what was happening. They didn't always succeed, as I indicated, but at least the ethic in the building encouraged that kind of cooperation. So after we passed, and the way we passed the biennial session, which permitted bills to carry over, we actually just, another fellow and myself who were involved in writing the amendment, who was also on the staff, his name is Judd Clark, we went around to editorial boards and made the case that the legislature essentially functions in two-year cycles, and they ought to be permitted to carry bills over rather than having to start all over again. And you ought to recognize reality of the two-year cycle, particularly because assembly terms are 2 years. And we managed to get that passed. The Speaker, Bob Moretti at the time, got the 27th vote for that measure in the Senate from Republican Senator Dennis Carpenter from Orange County. Carpenter told Bob at the time that he was opposed to the measure, that he was probably going to go out and oppose it publicly. And Bob said, I don't care, Denny, just vote for the damn thing. And he did. And that was how we got it out of the Senate. They had a relationship, a working relationship, and permitted him to make that request and to have it realized. So after the passage of that measure, we sat down and drafted a new set of joint rules that would reflect the fact that you were operating in a two-year cycle. Unfortunately, at the time, those rules, the draft rules, never got consideration. They were essentially discarded. So since that time, even though you have a biennial capability and a biennial session, you are operating as if you are functioning under two separate one-year sessions. And that was not the intent of the constitutional amendment. It was always the intent that after the constitutional amendment, you would consider and adopt a change in the rules that would schedule your work over the two-year period. So what did the rules provide for? essentially they provided for a much smoother flow of workload as well as a greater efficiencies in terms of your consideration of the workload that you face. We had periods in the rules of committee work only, periods of floor work only, periods for recesses built into the rules, period for budget work only, and a period for interim and oversight hearings. At the time, we talked more about interim hearings than we did about oversight, but the same point was made. So you got yourself, if those rules had been adopted, you would have been in a position where instead of, as it is today, when you get to policy committee deadlines and you have this frantic workload up to that policy committee deadline, you accomplish that. After it's over, many members wind up with very little to do after that deadline has passed. So it made no sense not to consider scheduling yourselves over that 2-year period. You could do that today. You need no subsequent change in the law or in the Constitution to schedule yourselves in that manner so that it would work better for you personally. It would work better for you with respect to your ability to get home. It would be, I think you would feel like your time was spent more productively. There are any number of other changes, I think, that you also could make that would make the legislature function much more effectively. In those days, we also had committee chairs frequently who were chairs of the opposite party from the Speaker. We also had committees that were much more balanced with respect to the partisan balance between the majority party and the minority party, which I think certainly enhanced the work of the committees because members felt, especially members of the minority party, felt that they were a real factor in the proceedings of the committee. Today, when you have committees that are so dramatically out of balance with respect to the partisan balances of that committee, I think you have the minority party feeling frequently that they really don't have a shake in the determinations that are being made by that policy committee. It also allowed for members who became experts in their field and became recognized statewide as experts in their field. And I can give you a few examples. Jack Knox, who chaired the Local Government Committee, was perceived statewide as an absolute expert in local government. Carly Porter, as well as his consultant Ron Roby, who is now a judge, were considered statewide as experts in water. Nick Petras was both in the Assembly and in the Senate and became an absolute tax expert and presided over the last round of complete reform of the tax structure of California over a period of years. Frank Lanterman, a Republican. Now, these are a mixture of Republicans and Democrats. Frank Lanterman, a Republican, became an absolute expert and renowned for his work in the mental health area. He did that under speakers that were mostly under Democratic speakers. Al Rada in the Senate. Al Rada became an absolute education expert, was perceived as that. More contemporarily, Gary Hart, as a member of this House and as a member of the Senate, was an expert in the K-12, particularly education area. The way you churn committee chairmanships today does not permit a person to have that kind of background and expertise. In addition, when you serve on too many committees and you have too many conflicts in terms of meeting times, it's very difficult for a member to acquire, especially in the era of term limits. It's very difficult for a member to acquire the kind of background that I'm sure all of you would agree is needed, at this point when you're dealing with subjects that are very difficult to deal with and very complex.
Mr. Houck, because our time today is so constrained, may I interrupt you and ask you a question, please?
Sure.
I wanted to ask you, you chaired the Constitutional Reform Commission for 2 years in the mid-1990s.
Right.
Are there one or two lessons from your leadership of that commission whose work was very detailed, very concrete, and very illuminating, but yet whose work product mostly never made its way to being effectuated?
Right.
What lessons can we learn from that experience?
The principal lesson you can learn from that experience is any changes you want to make with respect to the legislature and state government have to be made in the middle of a crisis, not after the crisis is over. Because that entity was formed early in the not early, I mean, earlier in the 1990s than later. Then we went to work, and by the time we were finished in 1996, the crisis of the then bad recession, nothing really compared to what we're experiencing today, was over. And at the time, Assemblyman Eisenberg and Senator Matty introduced the recommendations of the commission in each house, but the recommendations never even got a hearing. So I think the principal lesson, of that experience is that you've got to try to respond to a crisis in the middle of the crisis, but you have to try to do it intelligently. You have to try to do it not only looking at the immediate, but at the longer term. I think that, and I think that's really that's the principal lesson out of that experience.
It's a very important lesson for the committee to take to heart. Because of time constraints, may I ask you
yes.
Is it okay to take a couple questions if people have them of you?
Absolutely. I just want to add one other thing. The making significant changes, especially when they involve going to the ballot or they involve changing the law, bring you up against all of the entrenched forces of the status quo interests in Sacramento. And the power of the status quo is tremendous. There's no question about that. I think today, given the circumstances we find ourselves in, we've got to find a way to overcome that power and persuade status quo interests that it's not in their interest to maintain the status quo, because the voters of California at some point are going to demand that things change dramatically. It would be much better if we could do that with a real plan. It would be much better if this legislature could think about perhaps some of the things I'm suggesting and other things that will be suggested subsequently that you can do within your own power, that you don't have to change the law to do or go to the ballot to do, and thereby demonstrate that you are being responsive and that you can operate more effectively.
That frames our work very nicely. Ms. Evans.
Thank you very much. I want to just throw out a question. I don't necessarily think you can answer it, but I do want to bring this up because it's something that's been on my mind for quite some time. And you started to get to it just now in your most recent comments. But your commission studied this in depth, made a series of very good recommendations, I think. And then we also had the California Citizens Budget Commission that also looked at some of the same issues and made some of the same recommendations. Then we have California Forward, which more recently has studied again the same issues.
And I am part of that effort.
Yes. Okay. So many of these same.
I just love to tilt windmills here.
I think we all do. That's why we're here. Many of the same recommendations keep being made, though. I don't think there's a lot of mystery as to at least the broad outlines of what we need to do. My concern, and one of the things I think this committee needs to get a grasp on, or we lose this opportunity, is to identify what are the roadblocks to making these reforms. Because we've looked at them, studied them, recommended them repeatedly. What is it that's standing in our way? We have an emergency. We have a crisis. We need to deal with it. The voters are angry. They want us to do something. What we need to identify is what are the roadblocks keeping us from doing it, and how do we get beyond them, and how do we do it now?
The way I would answer that question, or the way I would respond to that, is to say, in addition to what I just said, is to say, with respect to the things I've been talking about here, there's nothing standing in your way of making these changes if you have the political will to do it. If you do not have the political will to make these changes, if you do not have the willingness to come together as a body to make these changes, they won't happen. You will not overcome the power of status quo interests if you are not able to persuade yourselves first, and then secondly, to persuade interest groups all, and I don't refer to them pejoratively, I'm just interest groups across the board, that it's not in their interests for California to continue down the road that it's on at the moment. Voters clearly have come to that conclusion, and collectively, if you all would come to that conclusion on a bipartisan basis, I don't think there's anything standing in your way from getting those things done.
Thank you, Ms. Evans. Thank you, Mr. Houck. We have time for two more questions in this segment before we proceed to the next one. We have an ambitious schedule. Ms. Hancock and then Ms. Ducheney.
And I think Mr. Strickland had a question.
Oh, and Mr. Strickland. Okay, very well.
Thank you. I'm very interested in the experiences that came before. And I recall there was a little Hoover Commission report at one time that tried to identify the barriers and talked about acting in crisis, take advantage of the crisis, as you said, and also talked about the need for sustained leadership driving it. And maybe those things are coming together now. But to follow up on Ms. Evans' question, it has seemed to me, looking at the work of California Forward and some of the other groups that are now gathering to repeat that we have a crisis and we must make some changes, that the idea of what I call smoothing out term limits so that there would be more stability, particularly people going into the assembly could stay there for 12 years, might be a way to do this. And then the other, of course, would be the majority vote budget, which I think California Forward recommended too.
Well, the Revision Commission recommended that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think there's any argument about the fact that our term limit law is not functional. It is the most severe in the nation. I think a 12-year serve it where you will change would accomplish the objectives that you are speaking of. It has to be accomplished without a benefit to all of you who are sitting here today. And I think that the measure that was on the ballot last year would have passed without that provision in it. That's against the conclusion of voters as represented, at least at the moment in public opinion surveys, that they have very little confidence in this legislature. So the question really becomes, do you put a measure like that on the ballot in 2010? Can it, and if you do, can it pass? I don't know the answer to that question. I think the jury is out on that. It may not be timely to do it in 2010. On the other hand, it may be. But a 12-year serve it where you will provision would provide more continuity, more institutional memory, provide for better leadership, and would, along with some of the other things that I was talking about, result in a much better functioning legislature.
Thank you, Ms. Hancock, Mr. Houck, Ms. Ducheney, and then concluding with Mr. Strickland.
Just to comment on Mr. Houck and I have been through, I think I was looking around when he was talking, and I think I'm the only one that was here when they presented the first Constitutional Revision Commission.
You know, I woke up this morning wondering how many people on this committee were alive when I walked into this building to go to work. Now, that's a real shocker.
Yeah. And just for everybody else, Mr. Houck and I also served on the Commission for Performance. What was it called? This governor's thing.
Performance
review,
yeah.
Which also didn't go very far. Because as soon as we put it on the table, the governor rejected it. So, it's even after people put tons of time. I mean, state staff put tons of time into coming up with some great recommendations, and our commission, really tried to come up with some things. And a few of them keep floating around, and some of them come back up and down through the budget. But I mean, it is the question of, are we serious about doing this? And I do remember when the Constitutional Revision Commission came out in '96, and everybody looked at it and the problem that I think came was a lot of people liked individual pieces of it. And I looked at this summary again that was in the notebook last night, and a lot of it you like pieces, and the problem was you could never get the pieces to all fit together. And I think Betty Carnett and a couple people tried to run pieces of it, and it just never worked that way. You either have to take a very large chunk of it and kind of make the pieces match, or not. And the term limits, I actually think your recommendation here was better than the one you just articulated, which is the 12 years in each house has been always my favorite. But whether it's the 3 4-year terms here or former Assemblyman Lou Papin's 4 and 6, that you don't change the number of terms, you just change the length of the terms to give people some room. But I like the 4-year terms, and I think if you could get people to be able to serve a decade wherever they're, and maybe they serve both houses and maybe they don't, but you get also that thing of not turning over a whole house every 2 years. You get the not so constant scramble for fundraising. You get a lot of advantages out of that, and I think the last time it did kind of come like that, people tried to present it, but it just never got legs in '96.
Right.
And
Correct.
I don't know how to really account for that, other
I
than
think-
what you said, that it wasn't a crisis anymore.
Right.
We had money, we were moving forward, and the world was changing.
And it's for those reasons that I have suggested today that you concentrate on, as in the work that you're doing, that you concentrate on those things that you have the power to control and to change without regard to anything else.
Yeah, because
That's
a
a
lot of
great-
it was constitutional amendments that had to go on the ballot, and that became more problematic than the pieces that maybe could have been done
I think the least
legislatively.
popular of the recommendations was our recommendations, the recommendations regarding eliminating elected state offices, because there were too many people around here who wanted to
Wanted
run
to
for
run.
those offices.
Yeah, no, exactly. The
Thanks very
superintendent's
much.
been an ongoing debate.
Yeah. Very important observation, Mr. Houck. Ms. Strickland. Mr. Strickland, excuse me. I'm so used to saying Ms. Strickland in my house. Mr. Strickland in yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I concur with Mr. Houck's remarks at looking at things that we can do ourselves, and I think that's very important. One of the things that I thought that you brought up that I, from my perspective, being on the Republican side of the aisle, was you're talking about history with Speaker Unruh and Willie Brown, where you actually had Republican chairs and you had different makeups of the committees. The amount of committee assignments, so you have the subject matter, again, before term limits, they had a chance to learn those issues for a longer period of time. But looking at, and I know it's the culture of today, but this is something we can fix. Looking at just the agenda today, if you look at the makeup of this committee, we actually have less than 2/3 representation. We have 30% representation from the Republican perspective. If you really wanted a bipartisan, I know both chairs are working towards that, and it's the culture we're in now. But this is something that we can fix today. If you really want, a bipartisan, maybe you do need to look at committee chairs being on the other side of the aisle. Maybe you do need to look at larger representation from the other perspective. If you want a final product that has a bipartisan makeup, it's looking at the committee representation. We have 30% representation. So that's something that we can do, and I was very interested that Mr. Houck brought that up, that in the past that there was committee chairs that were from the other side of the aisle, and that there was a different makeup of the committee.
There weren't too many, but there were some.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something we can do to collectively together to move California forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurtz. Mr. Houck, thank you very, very much. Really appreciate
Thank you all.
your focus. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next presenter is Carl Kurtz. Mr. Kurtz is the director of the National Conference of State Legislatures Trust for Representative Democracy. He's written extensively on American state legislative practices and public opinion. He used to teach at the University of Georgia. And his focus today is going to be to help inform our judgment by looking at federal and other state models of decision-making and what we can learn from those as we seek to reform ours. Dr. Kurtz.
Thank you. How do I turn on the PowerPoint? Hi. Hi. No. Thank you. Mr. Feuer and Mr. Desaulniers, members of the committee, I'm pleased to be here from the Denver office of the National Conference of State Legislatures. I've put up on the screen here a painting by an 18-year-old artist in Richmond, Virginia. It's one of a number of paintings that hang in the Senate Lounge, the Senator's Lounge in Richmond for the Virginia Senate. And I'm told that it is the Senator's favorite piece of art. I'm wondering if anybody knows why. They think it looks like the legislative process. And I bring that to you today because I think that, in fact, your excellent staff paper that you have before you does very well by leading off with a quote from Alan Rosenthal, in which he says that legislatures are naturally inefficient, unpredictable, and messy. And I just think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, and I thought you might enjoy this painting. So I've been asked to address the specific ideas that are in the staff paper from a multi-state perspective and try to share with you what the practices of some other states are on these issues. But before I do that, I think that it's important that we think about some basic principles that underlie efforts to change the rules. First of all, I would say that there's no such thing as perfect rules. Every state, if you ask me what's the model legislature for rules, I couldn't tell you what it is. All of them have flaws. All of them do good things. It's always a mix and almost always involves trade-offs among important values. And I think that as you're assessing changes to your rules, it's helpful to try to think about why do we have rules? What's their purpose? And I've outlined several here. You could expand on those, but facilitating deliberation, negotiation, and compromise is certainly a fundamental reason for rules. Promoting transparency and public trust, allowing the majority to rule, but protecting minority rights at the same time are vitally important aspects of rules. I could add other things you've talked about strengthening oversight, strengthening your ability to balance the power of the executive, and not least, strengthening your ability to represent your constituents. All those are fundamental things to keep in mind. Another basic principle that I think should underlie rules is that your rules ought to align with your practices. And if your practices are, if you're not practicing what your rules do, you either need to change the rules or you need to start practicing the rules. Otherwise, you look bad, the process does not have integrity, and it sows distrust among the members, and especially between the minority and the majority. The other introductory thing I would say is that legislative rules also have political rules. There are that underlie them. There's an old saying that the golden rule of politics is he who has the gold rules. In the case of legislative rules, the gold is the majority. I mean, the reality is in virtually any legislative body, the majority can and does change the rules to suit their circumstances. Another thing, and we'll mention this in some specific instances, almost any rule, because they usually have to have some exceptions, some escape clauses, they can almost always be gamed. And then the last introductory thing I would say is that while I'm here representing NCSL, NCSL has no position on these rules changes. I will occasionally express some opinions to you. These are my own personal opinions from approximately 40 years of working for, studying, and writing about legislatures, and some knowledge of the California legislature. I've probably been to Sacramento 40 times in 40 years at least in this business. So let's get to some of the specific recommendations. First of all, these are in the staff paper. First of all, setting priorities for legislative sessions. I believe this is a vitally important thing that ought to be done, but I think it's primarily a function of leadership and of primarily the majority caucus, but also the minority caucus trying to influence those priorities of sessions. The extent to which it's done around the country tends to vary a great deal based on the style of leaders and the approach of leaders. Some of them work that way. Others of them don't want to set priorities. They want the members to do it. They want the session to bubble up. So while I think it's a valuable thing to do, it's not universally practiced. I must say I have one of the proposals in this paper is that the process should be formalized in some fashion, and I would raise some questions about that. It seems to me that if you spend a lot of time debating session priorities, that these would be divisive issues. There would likely be a partisan battle at the beginning of the session, that the majority would eventually win. And what do you have as a result of that formal resolution? You've just got a resolution that can be overtaken by events and that can change. So I would just express a concern that if you formalize the process, it's possible that it would be counterproductive. I would give you an example of the Ohio House Democrats. The Democrats just took over the House in the last election after 15 years or so of Republican control. They organized a retreat of the House Democrats and actually invited one of my colleagues to facilitate the retreat. They worked for a couple of days to develop their priorities for the session, and in fact it worked. At the end of the session last month in October, they invited me back to facilitate a session working on next year's priorities, and at that point the Speaker, Armand Budish, reported to the caucus, here's what our priorities were and here's what we did, and in fact they had accomplished something on virtually every one of those. The last thing I just briefly mention here is Nebraska has kind of a unique way of individual members setting priorities. That the Nebraska senators in the unicameral can each designate one bill as their priority, and committees can designate two bills as priorities. And the result of that is that those bills that are designated as priorities, either by the members or by the committees, go to the top of the agenda for the committees. So this is a very democratic process of prioritizing. The second topic in the staff paper is more strict limits on bill introductions. And here you have a list of the basic arguments for and against strict bill limits. First of all, that it would reduce the number of bills. It would cause legislators to make decisions about which bills were most important. It would reduce committee workloads. It is an effective way of time management for a legislature. and some other smaller benefits there. The principal arguments against it are it does in fact restrict the rights of the members to introduce bills. And to the extent that every bill has a constituency, it may reduce your ability to serve your constituents. One of the easiest things that you can do to make a constituent happy is to introduce a bill to do what they want done, even if it never goes anyplace. Another problem with very strict limits is that lobbyists end up competing with each other, and lobbyists have to work hard on you to make sure that their bills get on the agenda. Some specific examples of legislatures that use bill limits. First of all, as I look over the list of about 20 or so states that make extensive use of bill limits, none of the full-time legislatures like yours, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, actually use bill limits. Or if they do, they're like yours, they're very large and not all that restrictive. There are others, though, at the opposite extreme are Colorado and Florida, where members can only introduce 5 bills in Colorado, and 3 of those have to be before December 1 at the pre-filing deadline, only 2 after the filing deadline. Florida has something similar. The bill limit process that appeals to me the most are the ones where members have unlimited bill introduction rights before the session begins or before some bill deadline. But after the session begins, there are very strict limits then of maybe 3, 4, 5 bills that you can introduce after the session has begun. That's a good workload management tool from my standpoint. Okay, committee control of bills. You are in the minority among the legislative chambers around the country in your practice of having a hearing on all bills. In the majority of chambers, they are the chair in most instances. Sometimes the speaker or the presiding officer or a rules committee might make the decision, but it's mostly committee chairs can choose to have hearings or not have hearings. I don't know, this one, I can go either way on it. On the one hand, yes, it does help in managing time and not spending a lot of time on superfluous bills, but it can lead to abuses. I would just point out to you in the case of the New York Senate, which was controlled for 35 or 36 years, I think, by the Republicans. The Democrats just took it over. One of the principal rules reform efforts that they are talking about is restricting the right of committee chairs to not to hear bills, allowing the ranking minority member, for example, to be able to call up a bill or any group of 3 members of the committee being able to call up a bill, because there was a history of majority party dominance of the minority through this rule. So there are downsides to that one. End of session log jams, and I'm going to move very quickly through these because I know we want to leave time. You know, log jams are part of human nature. We all procrastinate. Think about those term papers in college and all-night studying and that kind of thing. It's also, these log jams are an essential part of the bargaining process frequently. There are some things that can be done to mitigate the problem, but I don't know of any legislature that has eliminated them, at least not on a permanent basis. Sometimes they get eliminated because they've got really effective leaders who manage things smoothly, but the next session it may run into the same logjam problem. So there are things like having effective deadlines and looking at your rules and observing what you do. You have a good system of deadlines. Maybe you could do some things to move some of them up, but you're doing a lot of this. And again, leadership makes the difference here. One thing I note in your Constitution is your 30-day rule that bills cannot be heard by a committee. I don't know what the solution is, but if you could change that in the Constitution, that seems to me to be out of the horse and buggy days and not as relevant in the world of the Internet. Maybe there's some kind of workaround in terms of interpretation of that. But if you could get your committees working earlier on bills and not having to wait a month, that might be beneficial. Okay, gut and amends. This is something that's in common use in other states. They have a lot of colorful names. In South Dakota, they call it hog housing. They call it catfish amendments in North Carolina, relating to filleting a bill, I guess. Strike everything bills, strip and replace. These are frequently used. They do create problems with transparency and the public trust, but they're an important leadership tool. They're an important ability of negotiators at the end, once they've reached a deal, to find a vehicle to get them done. The principal mitigation of abuses of gut and amend are germaneness rules. The only difficulty with germaneness rules is this is a classic case of the majority really determines what's germane and what's not germane. You can put out all the criteria you want to, but if you've got 50% plus one vote, you're not going to, the majority is going to prevail on that. Condensing session time. And here my reference is in general to the proposal you've got on the ballot to go to a part-time legislature, or you may have on the ballot, or your own response to that. There's been talk about 6 months in session, and those are on your list of options. And the basic point that I would make here is that regardless of the specific session time limit, you can effectively manage time in the legislature, even under strictures like Florida has, where they've only got 60 days in session. Well, they've got a schedule process that handles that. They allow their committees to act when they're not in session and to hear bills and to begin hearing bills right away. And it works for them. In a state that is not as large as yours, but it's our fourth largest state now, and it's a very diverse state, and they have very large districts like you do. So they're similar to you in every way except the 60-day session. Giving priority to budget over policy bills, you can see a couple of points there. I'm actually going to skip over this, other than to say that virtually every legislature that I know of struggles with this problem of meshing policy recommendations that spend money with the budget process and the appropriations process. There's no perfect solution in it. I would urge you, though, to be careful that whatever you do not weaken your policy committees. So lastly, there was a new item added to the paper in the newest version that I got about continuity of staffing. And I would strongly endorse the ideas in that anything that you can do to ensure continuity, particularly of the committee consultants, and to emphasize the ability to develop expertise over time would help to mitigate one of the biggest impacts of term limits as I've observed it.
Dr. Kurtz, if I could, because there are panelists who want to ask questions, and we have a short time, I'd like to turn, if I could, to Mr. Leno.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us and sharing your 40 years of expertise. I didn't have a chance after the first speaker to comment, not unlike some of my colleagues, with regard to so many of the dysfunctional components of what we're going to be talking about over the next few months, I think, go back to term limits. And I've got a book title rattling in my head called Yet Another Unintended Consequence of Term Limits, because so many things, I think, yet again, and with regard to more campaigning, more fundraising, less focus on our policy work, the politicization of so much of our policy work, dare I say, more so in the Assembly than Senate, due to the fact that the terms are 2 years and 4 years, the less stability among leadership because of 18 to 24-month leadership terms. So it just on and on and on, so many of them. So I know we'll be talking more about that in the days to come. I did want to get your take more specifically on the rather severe calendar restrictions and deadlines that we have in our process. And we do see that we run furiously during a few short weeks of the year, and then there are long pauses and more workload for some folks than for others, depending upon committee assignments and such, because now in recent years so much of our work has been budget related, those involved with the budget work with much greater workload, and others, once those deadlines have passed relative to their own policy and bill work, pauses of not much work at all. Can you comment on our tight timelines?
Well, as I said, I think you have effective timelines and you follow them. The biggest change that I would suggest making to that is finding some way to move the committee process up earlier in the year. As I understand it, your bottleneck occurs in March and April when the committees really start hearing bills and then have that early May deadline or late April. I don't remember exactly what it is. If you can get your committees working even in December, get your committees hearing bills in January and February, then I think you're starting to manage that workload effectively, and then the deadlines after that are much more reasonable.
Thank you.
That's probably a good idea, and with the thought of instead of our January, February deadlines for idea introductions, and then to Ledge Council pushing that up before the first of the year.
Which may also involve filing deadlines, earlier filing deadlines.
Thanks very much. I'm cognizant of the fact that our next panelist is Treasurer Lockyer, who has very limited time. So, Mr. Blumenfield, Ms. Ducheney, Mr. Strickland, ideally briefly, please, and Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Doctor, for your comments. I really appreciate them. And I had a couple of questions and sort of an observation prior to the questions. The way that we do our bill process, I find often it lends itself to a competitive process rather than a collaborative process. And I'm sort of curious how that compares to other states. And in particular, when you talk about the number of bills, I wonder if there is